Hello there, welcome back. This is another brand new segment of The Lost and Forgotten on TV1. Last week we were discussing several facts surrounding the Bohra community of Sri Lanka. We in fact focused on their origins, the wonderful personalities that the community has produced and several other factors surrounding this community here in the country. Today's topic of discussion will in fact be an extension of last week's episode. Tonight we would be focusing on the several cultural aspects in terms of the Bohra community, their current situation and several other important facts that you need to know. Joining me in the studios this evening as well is Dr. Zameer Careem from the University of Colombo. Good evening to you, Zameer. Welcome to the show.
Very good evening, Hassaan.
Zameer, let's start off the show by talking about various structures that are associated with the Bohra community. Will you be able to talk us through certain important structures in this country that is linked to the community?
So there are many Bohra structures in the nation, as you rightly pointed out. So when it comes to the Bohra community, it's usually the mosques. Okay, so Dawoodi Bora Mosques. So the very first mosque that was built in this country is in Gaul. Okay, so it's a heritage building right now. So it was built in 1850 by Karimji Jaffarji. Okay, and then when he moved to Colombo, he built another mosque down 4th Cross Street, Petta. So this mosque was named after him because it was built by Karimji Jaffarji. It is known as the Karimi Masjid. Okay, so this is the second most important mosque. So Karimji Jaffarji was a business tycoon. He was a philanthropist, an altruist, and he owned vessels, he owned ships. He had like a fleet of ships and they were called the bungalows as well. And then Adam Ali's, they built their own mosque, another Dawoodi Bora Mosque. It was financed by the Adam Ali family, E.G. Adam Ali. This was in the 1950s during that period, and this was in Bamlapitia area. So there was another mosque built, the Husseini Masjid, down Adam Ali Place, Glenabar Place. So there you have the third mosque. And the Jaffarjis, who are also Bohras, so when they moved to Jaffna, they built a mosque in Jaffna.
Right.
And that mosque was ravaged by war and later it was refurbished and it was opened by Sayyidina Mufaddal Saifuddin this couple of years back. So there are 4 mosques that are associated with the Dawoodi Bohra community. But talking about their residences, now last episode we spoke about Lakshmi Garibalawa. So Lakshmi Garibalawa was originally owned by Sir Charles Henry de Souza. So when the de Souzas went bankrupt, so they were planning, the house was actually mortgaged, okay, so, the de Souzas. So in order to help kind of purchase the property, what Adamji Lukmanji, he's also a Bohra, he was a Bohra businessman, a business mogul. So he purchased the property in 1922-23, that period. And he was also a famous art collector. He was an antiquarian, he was a bibliophile, he had like an impressive collection of artwork and, you know, furniture and glassware and all that. So during the 1940s, when Second World War broke out, what happened was this property, Lakshmi Garibalawa, which was then called Saifi Villa because after it was occupied by the Bohras, but Saifi Villa, the original term was coined somewhere in the 1970s. So it was called Lakshmi Garibalawa even back then. But anyways, so this property that was occupied by the Lukmanjis was taken over by the Royal Air Force. So the British soldiers occupied Saifi Villa in the 1940s. And they ransacked the place. So most of these collectibles, whether it be those antiques that Lukmanji had collected and even Charles Henry de Souza's collection and his son's collection. So most of those stuff that were in the house were ransacked. The entire house was pillaged by the British soldiers. So when they left, most of the stuff were not there because the British soldiers had kind of destroyed the entire property. So it had fallen into wreck and ruin by the time the British left the country. So the house, as I mentioned earlier, is known for its impressive gates because it is said that it was inspired by the gates at Buckingham Palace, and that's what inspired them to kind of have the same gates. And the gates at Saifi Villa inspired the gates at the museum in Egypt, in Cairo. So there is a story as such as well. And this was a location, it was a film location as well, Lakshmi Garibalawa. It was used by Lester James Pearce, the renowned director, so he used it as well in one of his films. The film which was directed by Lester James Pearce, Kali Yuga, this was in the 1980s. So they used this very property. It was used in the film as well. And the film was chosen for the Cannes Film Festival. This was in the 1980s, early 1980s. Likewise, there were many other residences which the Bohras built. For example, Karimji Jaffarji, whom I mentioned, so he was also known for his extensive amount of land that he owned and the sprawling estates and the stately homes. So he had one in Nuwara. Back then, not many people owned properties in Noor, but Karimji Jaffarji had a villa over there, the Jaffar Villa. This was in Noor, and then he also had a Isai Villa in Colombo. So this was in the Bamlapitia area, and they also owned properties down 4th Cross Street. So entire 4th Cross Street, that was like the place where all these Bohras originally lived, because that's where they had their businesses. So as I mentioned in the previous episode, if you remember correctly, they used to run their businesses on the ground floor while the family used to live on the top floor. So these properties eventually became their main business centers, their shops, while the family moved to various places. So they settled in Cinnamon Gardens as well as in Bamlapitia. There was also another philanthropist as well as a business baron named Hiptullah Boy. I spoke about him as well. And Hiptullah Boys also owned massive properties in the country. They owned around 3 acres of land. I'm talking about 1870s, 1880s, that period in Bamlapitia. And they also owned like an acre property next to the Vellapattu railway station.
Right.
And they also owned several properties, not just in Colombo, but across the island. So they owned estates and rubber plantations and even cinnamon plantations, and they cultivated spices, exported local produce, and all these structures were the famous Bohra structures in the nation. And Saifi Villa, like despite the fact that when you really go to the Lakshmi Garibalawa, you'll notice that on the gate you have the initial S. It's still there. That is because it was originally owned by the De Soizas. So the Soiza S. But later, because the property was named in honor of Saifuddin as Saifi Villa, so the S has remained.
They could share the S.
They could share the S, exactly. So whenever the Bohra leaders come to the country, the Dayal Mutlaq and those spiritual leaders, the unrestricted missionaries, when they come to the country, they usually live in Saifi Villa. So Saifi Villa plays host to all these dignitaries and foreign diplomats who are Bohras, or even a Bohra spiritual leader or a temporal head comes to our country. They usually live in Saifi Villa.
Right.
And back then, the other villa that I spoke about is a villa which was owned by Karimji Jaffarji. Even that particular property has played host to many people, including Orabi Basha.
Right, interesting. Zameer, when we talk about the Bora community, we know that they have existed in this land for several years. How is their relationship with the other communities that are living in this nation?
They have maintained strong ties with almost every community in the country, and in particular with the Parsis. The reason why they maintain strong ties with the Parsis, back then they maintained strong ties, they established businesses together.
Right.
So Kaiser Street, Messenger Street, Main Street, 4th Cross Street, 5th Cross Street, Bankshall Street. Bankshall Street, the original business was established by Adamji Lukmanji with a Parsi. So the Parsis and the Bohras worked together. The reason being that they both hailed from Gujarat, because most of the Parsis who came to Ceylon, though their ancestors hailed from Persia, they came mainly from the Bombay Presidency and Gujarat, from Kachmandvi and Kathiawar and all those regions from where the Bohras also came from, and they both spoke Gujarati. Okay, so because their language is Gujarati, the Bohras have their own language, Lisaldaba, which is in fact an ancient language which originated like around 1,000 years back, but it's a combination of Arabic, Persian, Urdu and Gujarati. Okay, but they are very proficient in Gujarati, the Bohra community. The Bohras maintain strong ties with the Parsis, but they also maintain strong ties with other Muslim communities in the country. So in the 1880s, when Orabi Basha was exiled to the country, when he lived in Karimji Jaffarji's home, and he also lived in Kandy, and this Kandy residence where he lived was originally owned by Gate Mudaliar Susur de Soiza. He was in fact related to Charles Henry de Soiza. So this property was in fact leased out, and he was in fact a tenant. Orabi Basha came to our country. Orabi Basha, I'm sure that you must have heard of him as a Zairian. So Orabi Basha was in fact this Egyptian leader. He was head of the nationalist movement. He was involved in the soldiery. So he was this man who protested against the British as well as the French forces. So he was exiled by the British. He had this rift with the Egyptian government, and they exiled him to Ceylon. So this was in the 1880s, early 1882, that period. So he came to Ceylon with 52. So his entourage comprised of 52 members, his wives and his children and his friends and all.
They were all Bohras?
They were not Bohras.
Right.
The Orabi Basha was an Arab man who came from Egypt. So he came to the country in 1880s. So when he came to the island, so he was exiled like for life. Okay, so he was not expected to go back to Egypt. So he was exiled to a far-flung British colony like Ceylon. So this was in the 1880s. He came to the nation. When he came to the nation, he became very popular. He was received well by the Muslim community over here because he has fought against the British. He was an anti-imperialist. He was in fact in favor of promoting Islam, and he was a nationalist. He was acclaimed all over the Muslim world. So when he came here, he was accepted well by the Muslim community. He lived in Kandy as well as in Colombo, and he sent his children to school here, and they received English education. But what is important about Arabi Basha's stay in Sri Lanka is it had an immense influence on the Muslim community, because it is Arabi Basha who influenced the Muslims in order to establish educational institutions such as Al-Madrasatul Zahira, which eventually became Zahira College. So Wapachi Marikar as well as Abdul Aziz, so they came together, decided to establish a Muslim educational institution in the country.
Right.
And this was because of the forethought of Arabi Basha. That is one. And when Arabi Basha wanted to help the schools, he wanted the financial support as well. So he approached his very good friend Careem Jafarji,
Who was a Bohra?
who was a Bohra. So Careem Jafarji, being a Bohra man, now he sent his children to Royal College. Okay, so Careem Jafarji's children were royalists, but he wanted to promote Muslim education in the country, because even when his eldest son went to Royal back then, there was only a single Muslim. This was in the 1880s. So Careem Jafarji, a Bohra merchant, he was very interested in promoting Muslim education among the Muslims. Okay, so he financed the construction of buildings, supplied furniture to Zahira College, and it was Careem Jafarji who even established schools, those madrasas. Now the madrasa has received a different meaning right now, but back then those were religious schools that taught Muslim students almost everything
They
in terms
were
of language,
complete educational
complete
institutions.
education, in the sense they were taught language, and there was also Arabic Tamil which was taught, Arabic and English and almost everything. So there was this Chesma phase which was established in the Wolfendal area by Careem Jafarji, a Bohra. And the Bohras were also instrumental in developing all the mosques in the country that were built by the Moors as well. And when the British acquired, because when the Muslims were given the land, the Kuppiyawat burial ground, when it was given to the Muslims, the British requested the Muslims to build a wall. So when the Muslims were asked to build a wall, to erect a wall, it was in fact a Bohra man, Careem Jafarji, who came forward and financed the construction of the wall. So likewise, the Bohras have maintained strong ties with not just with the Parsis and the Muslims, but also with the Sinhalese and the Tamils and the rest of the population. They have always lived in friendly brotherhood, pooling the resources of each for the benefit of all. So they're known for their camaraderie and solidarity with almost every community in the nation.
Speaking about the contributions, you spoke extensively on the contributions rendered by several Bohra community members to the education sector. Are there any contributions rendered by this particular community towards other fields? Let's talk about entertainment and health, for example.
Okay, so talking about health, I think I have to start with Mr. Careem Jafarji again, because it was Careem Jafarji, this was in the 1880s, 1890s, that period. He in fact built and donated wards to the Lady Havelock Hospital. So you have the Lady Ridgway Hospital, and then you have the Lady Havelock Hospital, named after the wife of the former British governor, Havelock. So the Lady Havelock Hospital had 2 wards that were donated by Careem Jafarji. Likewise, the Bohra community has produced numerous doctors, and in the previous episode I spoke about Adamji Lukmanji Maternity and Nursing Home, which is down Prince of Wales Avenue, and there was a very famous doctor who came from the Hazari family. So you had the Jafarji Hazari, Hassaan Ali Jafarji Hazari, and the Hazari family has produced numerous doctors. Likewise, we have the neurosurgeon at the moment, Ali Boy, as well as we have had a surgeon back then, from the Mahmuji clan. So there were many Bohras who have stamped their identity when it comes to the medical sector. Talking about entertainment again, the very first film that was produced in Sri Lanka, the Rajakiya Vikramaya, meaning royal adventure. It was a silent film. Okay, so this film was produced in the 1920s, and it was produced by a Bohra, Nurbais. Okay, so you had the Bora brothers, the Nurbai clan that came to Ceylon in the 1860s. They were affluent. They belonged to the higher echelons of society. One of the brothers, J.G. Nurbai, he was in fact instrumental in establishing a film company here, the Eastern Film Company. Okay, and he was the man who produced the very first film, Rajakiya Vikramaya, meaning royal adventure. This was in 1920s, and the film was screened not just in India but also in Singapore, but before it got screened in Ceylon, the reel got burnt. It was burnt overseas.
Right.
But the interesting part is the man who was featured in the film, the hero, was in fact Dr. N.M. Pereira. So Dr. N.M. Pereira, the former finance minister, he was head of the opposition party, he was a Trotskyist, he was attached to the Lanka Samasamaja party. So he was this 20-year-old dashing young lad who was featured in this film, Rajakiya Vikramaya, Royal Adventure, which was produced by a Bohra. So it was Noorbai who produced it. And the company was involved in bringing down films from India as well as English movies were screened by the Bohras, and because the Bohras worked closely with the Parsis, because back then it's the Parsis and the Bohras who worked together. So there was this very famous Elphinstone bioscopic company which was based in Calcutta, and this was run by a Parsi named Madan, and his son was also living in Ceylon at the time. So the Elphinstone Theatre, the Majestic Cinema, Empire Theatre, and all these theatres were in fact run by the Parsis in the country, and the Parsis were helped by the Bohras as well. So all these English and Indian movies that were screened in the country were because of the influence of the Bohras, who dabbled in the entertainment business as well. And yeah,
that's some fascinating piece of history. Let's shift our attention towards the cultural aspects of the Bora community. We know that every community has their unique way of their practicing their cuisine and the attire as well. Let's talk about the cuisine just to start off. Zameer,
okay, so
what
the
was the
Bora
cuisine
cuisine is quite, I would say, is very unique because the way you consume the meal, because they're known for their communal gatherings, they're known for their communal meal. So the Bohras are also known for their interfaith dialogue. They in fact appreciate the fact if others get to learn about their community. So it's through these gatherings, the communal meals, that another person who doesn't belong to the Bora community gets to learn a great deal about the community is through these gatherings. So the Bora cuisine is very different. So there is a way that you actually have a Bora meal.
Right. Okay? What is it?
So unlike the Moors, for example, that you have this savan, right, like the large platter. So the Bohras also have a large silver platter known as the tal.
Right.
Okay. So what you basically do is that you should have like around 8 or 9 people in order to have like a proper meal. So it doesn't matter whether you're a Bohra or even if you're a non-Bohra, even non-Muslims are in fact invited, so that this gives them an opportunity to learn about the Bora community, because they're very welcoming, they're known for their hospitality, their warmth, and their loving and compassionate group of people. So what they do is that they place a square-shaped cloth on the floor. Okay, that's the first thing that you do. And then you place a stool. Okay, so unlike the Moors, for example, who place it on the floor, directly on the floor, the Bohras place a stool, all right, and on the stool they place this huge plate. It's a huge silver platter, okay, on which you have various dishes, right? So before you start eating, you got to sit, like you form like 8 or 9 people would sit together, and then you place this large platter, okay. So the very first thing that you're supposed to do before you consume a meal is to wash your hands. So you've got to rinse your hands. So you have this basin and a jug that will be brought. Okay, so you have the chalam chilota, basically meaning you'll have a basin and you have a jug. So you wash your hands. Okay, so after you wash your hands, the very first thing that you have is in fact salt. Salt. Okay. The reason why you're given salt is because the Bohras believe that the salt in fact cleanses your palate. It enlivens your palate, and it makes your palate sensitive to all the flavors that you're going to consume.
Right.
And it is believed by the Muslims, especially by the Shia Muslims, that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had mentioned that before you consume a meal and after your meal, you're supposed to have a pinch of salt. The reason being that it will help ward off 72 different types of ailments. So that is the reason why you have salt before you have the proper meal.
Zameer, just out of sheer curiosity, is this practiced even at present?
Yeah, it is practiced by all the Bohras across the world, because you have Bohras living in almost 40 countries or so. So Bohras across the world, especially during their festivals and then the Eid and all those celebrations, they have these communal meals, and then you have the huge dal, and before that, before you have the actual meal, you get the namak, which is the salt. Okay, you have the salt. And usually it's the youngest member who will pass this salt pot around.
Oh, right.
Okay, so the youngest member who's who's in the gathering, so he will pass it over, and then he or she, and then that's the first thing that you'll have. Then unlike the rest of the Indian or Sri Lankan population, they don't begin with like rice or anything as such. they start with mithais and karas. Mithai meaning sweets. So they start their meal with sweets. Okay, so you can have any form of mithai. You can have kajal ki halwa, which is like the carrot halwa. You can have jalebis or bundi or whether all sorts of Indian delicacies, tantalizing Bori delicacies. You can have them, including ice cream. You're supposed to have mithai first.
Right.
That's how it happens in the Bora community. So you have the mithai, and then you have the karas. Karas are the savory dishes. Savory dishes in the sense the Bohras are known for the Bori samosas.
Right.
Okay, so samosas are of, you can say they're of Central Asian origin. They're very popular in Persia, introduced into India. Okay, so you have the samosas, and then you have all sorts of other dishes. You can have your chicken, your tandoori chicken, and you have your mutton and seafood and all those things. So you have all those, delicacies. And then you have the next set, which comes is in fact the Roen. In Sri Lanka, I'm not sure, but in India, usually you have the Roen. So you have the achari Roen, which is basically like mutton. So mutton, tenderly cooked mutton, lamb. So it has to slip off from the bone. So that's how tender it should be cooked. So you eat it with your paratha or a chapati or anything. So that's basically the next meal that you're doing. And then you go to the next, which is the actual course. Then you have the Bori Dum Biryani. So with the Bori Dum Biryani, you have the dal chawal, which is rice with dal. Then you have the kari chawal, which is with meat and rice. So you have all these dishes. But the most important thing about the Bori cuisine is that you will not move to the next course unless you have completed everything that is before you.
Right.
So they believe in the whole concept of not wasting food, so that you prevent all kinds of flamboyant lifestyle is being frowned upon by the Bohras.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zameer, for appearing on tonight's episode of The Lost and Forgotten, where we learned several other facts surrounding the Bora community that have lived in this country. We definitely will be back with more interesting facts that's coming your way next Friday at 9:30 p.m. on TV1. Until next time, have yourselves a wonderful week ahead. Stay safe, take care, and God bless.